Hey Rebel Rouser, I'm Alan Voivada. This is Star Wars 7x7, your daily dose of Star Wars joy, and thank you so much for joining me for it. And thank you especially to the patrons who help support the creation and production of this show every day for you with their help at patreon.com/SW7x7. All right, so it is the 25th anniversary of the Phantom Menace this year, and every month we've been doing an episode related to the Phantom Menace. Today we're going to do that episode, and it's going to relate to pod racing. And it turns out that pod racing is actually native to the Phantom Menace, as it turns out. So the very first mention of it in canon storytelling is not actually in the movie. It's in the novelization, which came out prior to the release of the movie. And as opposed to other episodes that we've done where we were looking at an earlier draft of the Phantom Menace script and talking about differences between what there was in the early drafts and what appeared on the screen, there's nothing really different about the idea of pod racing. There's, a little stuff around Anakin trying to, not necessarily race his pod because anything that Watto owns or anything that Anakin owns could be something that Watto owns. So the pod racer being built in secret, right? There's a little bit about that, but it just plays out differently. The way that they try to con Watto out of allowing Anakin to be one for all intents and purposes through the pod race, that's a little different. The two-headed announcer doesn't appear. Jabba is the one who's doing all the announcing. And that's pretty much it. And aside from that, it's really the episode 1 racer video game where we learn anything more about pod racing. We know that it takes place on Malastare as well from Qui-Gon Jinn. And that's pretty much it in canon storytelling. Obviously, the racer video game is part of Legends, or the expanded universe, if you will, and we were talking a little bit about that yesterday, and I feel like it still kind of applies in a way, right? I still feel like the idea of racing in various pod racing venues on other planets, even though that hasn't been brought back into canon officially, like it still feels like it's legit. One thing that seemingly holds up between canon and Legends is that it is exceedingly rare for a human to be a pod racer, and so it is mostly popular among non-human species, and that could be the particular reason why the Empire cracked down on it once the Republic fell. It was already sort of an Outer Rim sport to begin with, and one that was probably frowned upon by the Galactic Republic. Certainly there were a lot of illegal gambling things happening around it, criminal syndicates involved, and obviously Jabba the Hutt's appearance in the Phantom Menace is certainly a huge indicator of all of that. So yeah, the Empire actually cracked down on pod racing. It went like super underground, and then they would have events that would pop up and disappear, and they would do it out in the unknown regions as well. But Jabba the Hutt was definitely more brazen than that. I mean, with the Boonta Eve Classic, that actually was still taking place out in the open, and it happens to be one of the things that you potentially get to go through in Star Tours, right? Like the Star Speeder ends up on Tatooine and flying alongside some of the pod racers. That happens in 1 BBY, according to Wikipedia, so it happens in just a year before A New Hope. And even though not only the Empire, but the New Republic tried to crack down on pod racing as well, pod racing was still happening in the galaxy, according to Legends, as late as 137 ABY. So we're talking multiple generations past the generations of Leia and Luke and Han. And I'll say it's surprising to me that the infrastructure that's sort of been built for pod racing within Star Wars storytelling, like that, we haven't had opportunities to take advantage of that more. I mean, I know it was, swoop bike races or something like that in the Bad Batch in season 2. Wasn't pod racing, and probably would have been problematic to make it pod racing, considering that we only had, the Bad Batch members who were human, and therefore it would have been, a distinct disadvantage for them pod racing in that particular case. And speaking of infrastructure and stuff, according to the Art of book for the Phantom Menace, the deserts of Tatooine being the location of the high-speed pod races, as the film's race was being mapped out and it was realized that vehicles traveling at several hundred miles per hour would cover vast expanses of terrain, Lucas requested that the art department create as many creatures as possible to dot the landscape. And so, led by concept artist and creature designer Taro Whitlatch, the artist created entire entire ecologies and food chains featuring the Tatooine equivalents of armadillos, jackrabbits, prairie dogs, and coyotes, to name a few. And later on it says, with respect to pod racers, speeders, and droids, all have to be built to handle the three constants of life on Tatooine: lack of resources, relentless heat, and whipping sand. As we see in the construction of C-3PO, much of the technology on Tatooine looks as if it has been scavenged from mechanical debris, and it exhibits a cobbled together, weather-beaten, post-apocalyptic appearance, which then wildly differs from what we saw with the mods in the time of the Book of Boba Fett in 10 ABY. So I guess things got a little bit better in that regard, at least for some folks. So that's what I've got for you about pod racing as it appears in the Phantom Menace, and what we know a little bit about before and after the Phantom Menace, and also about how it came to be, some of the background stuff too. And that is going to do it for this episode of the podcast. If you enjoy this daily dose of Star Wars joy, I hope you'll consider sharing it with other folks who might appreciate a daily dose of Star Wars joy. You can tell them online, you can tell them in person, you can tell them via algorithms with ratings and reviews and likes and subscribes and follows and joins and all that good stuff. And you can even help me produce this daily dose of Star Wars joy. Every little bit helps, and you can find out more about that at patreon.com/SW7X7, and thank you for considering it. And it just remains for me to say thank you so much for joining me for this episode, as always, and may the Force be with you, wherever in the world you may be.
7x7 is not endorsed or sponsored yet by Lucasfilm Limited, Disney, or 20th Century Fox, and is intended for entertainment and information purposes only. Star Wars, the Star Wars logo, all names and pictures of Star Wars characters, vehicles, and any other Star Wars related items are registered trademarks and/or copyrights of Lucasfilm Limited, or their respective trademark and copyright holders. May the Force be with them. All original content is copyright by Star Wars 7x7. We hope you love it.